Genesis 20 and 21. So for the past, really, 9 chapters, maybe 10 chapters, we've been looking at the person of Abraham and looking at God's work in his life and specifically looking at this covenant that God made with Abraham that has come up. It's been repeated 9 times over the previous 9 chapters. And we've looked at various events, everything from Sodom and Gomorrah last week to the promise back in chapter 17 of Isaac and him being even named by God, saying that you will bear a son and you're to name him Isaac. And we'll see today that Isaac is finally born. But I wanted to point out to you kind of the progression here of the covenants that we've unfolded over the previous 9 chapters. So there's 3 aspects of the covenant, as we've talked about at length. There is this national aspect of land being promised, a personal aspect of descendants, and then a universal aspect of salvation. Well, as the covenant's first given in chapter 12, the very first thing that is the focus of the covenant and of the narrative is the land, right? And we see that Abraham finally arrives in the land at the end of chapter 12. And while he never possesses the land, in the sense of kind of owning it, nevertheless, he is in the land, and that happens pretty early on. Well, then over the next really 8 chapters, the focus is descendants, this promise of descendants, which, again, must have seemed like a fairly wild promise of God, because when the promise is given, Abraham is 75 years old, and his wife is 65, and they're childless, and they're told you're going to have a family one day, which again must have seemed quite wild. I hope that I don't have a child at 75 personally, but he was hoping for one. And so really over the past, again, 8, 9 chapters, that's been the focus, right? And we saw even Abraham's lack of faith in his attempt to help God out in the birth of Ishmael, through Hagar, and so that's kind of the focus, which is going to culminate really in today's chapter with the birth of Isaac, and then really after Isaac arrives, really from about chapter 27, really through the end of the book, the focus changes to the eventual fulfillment of salvation and of the promised Messiah. Is kind of how the covenant turns, and so. While various aspects of the covenant are mentioned here or there in each chapter, there really is kind of an overall progression that's taking place as the chapters tick off. And so, Genesis 20, in verse 1, it starts out and says this. It says, "And Abraham journeyed from there to the south." Well, where is there? Well, you have to turn all the way back to Genesis chapter 18, verse 1, when it says, "And the Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth trees of Mamre." And so this is going to be a little bit north and a little bit west of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is what we focused on for the past 2 chapters. And Abraham journeys south from there. And so if you think about Palestine, Abraham is kind of dwelling really kind of towards the very middle of the country. And now he's going about 30 miles south and west. And he dwelt, it says in verse 1, between Kadesh and Shur, and stayed in Gerar. Now this is actually interesting because while Gerar was technically in the Promised Land, it's part of Palestine, it's actually on the very edge of Palestine and Egypt. And this land at that time was actually controlled by the Philistines. And we learn later on in the book of Genesis that the reason why Abraham actually went to Gerar, which is near the coast, was because there was yet another famine that had taken place. And he's probably logically looking for a place where there's actually sort of food available and things. And of course, Gerar being near the coast, there would have been fishing and that type of thing. And so it kind of makes sense to go there, even though it was controlled by the Philistines. Verse 2, "Now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent, and he took Sarah." And so this ought to ring a bell in your mind, right? This is not the first time that Abraham and Sarah have pulled off this trick. The first time actually was 25 years prior to this. This is back at the end of Genesis 12, when there was yet an earlier famine in the land. And Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt, and they lied and said that Sarah is my sister, and she was taken into Pharaoh's harem. God then allowed Pharaoh to see Abraham showing endearment, it says, to his wife. He realized that they were actually married and let her go, and was kind of rebuked by Pharaoh there because of his deception, and they ended up getting some gold and silver and cattle and went back up to the Promised Land. Well, that was 25 years prior to this. And you got to sort of wonder, had they learned their lesson, right? While they escaped, and maybe arguably escaped with material possessions from Egypt, nevertheless, they were rebuked by Pharaoh and sort of God through Pharaoh at that earlier occasion. And you wonder, perhaps maybe they would have stopped kind of pulling this charade off. But here it is again, 25 years later. And again, I got to sort of wonder about this entire thing, because at this point, Sarah is 90 years old, right? Now, how good looking is your wife when you're worried that she's going to be taken in to the harem of the king when she's 90 years old? Well, that was his fear, we'll see here in just a moment. And so hence the lie that she is my sister. Verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now, I got to think, if I am Abimelech, that I'm going to be maybe, I guess number one, a bit alarmed by this pronouncement that, hey, you are a dead man. But secondarily, as we'll see, as was his perspective coming up here in the next verse, I'm going to be sort of a little bit like, no, that's not fair, because I didn't know. And here, God, you're going to kill me because of this sin I have committed, but I didn't actually know I was committing the sin. And I think here that there's something that is maybe instructional for us here, right? And that it's possible, and maybe even you can think of an occasion in your life where you committed a sin. Maybe it wasn't intentional. Maybe you didn't know. Maybe somebody was perhaps, offended by something that you did or said or didn't do or didn't say or whatever. And you didn't actually intend to offend someone. You didn't actually intend to do wrong, but actually you did do wrong, right? And what is the requirement if you ever find yourself in one of those occasions? Well, I think the requirement is that as soon as we are aware of our sin, we want to repent of our sin, right? And again, maybe it wasn't even your intent, right? Maybe again, someone maybe is upset with you because of something that you aren't even aware of. In Matthew 5, as Jesus is talking in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this. He says that if you're going to worship, and there while you're at the altar, Jesus says, if you become aware, if you are reminded that somebody has something against you, to leave your gift at the altar, go and find them and make it right. And so that's actually a really important teaching, right? Because what Jesus teaches there in Matthew 5, I think is 45 and following, is that, you could be totally fine. You're just there worshiping God, right? You're just there, and as far as you're concerned, everything is good between you and the other person. But all of a sudden you're reminded that, hey, somebody has something against me, or I suspect that they do, because, hey, they treated me sort of in a different way, or said something, or I got a strange email, or whatever. And again, you have no problem with them at all. But they have a problem with you, perhaps, and so there's a fracture in relationship. It's that important that you would then stop your worship, and you would go out and seek them and try to make it right? Which, again, is an important teaching. And oftentimes that passage even is misread. I've even heard it preached and taught wrong, as if Christ said, hey, if you're ever at the altar and God reminds you that you have a problem with someone else, well, then go and make it right, which is not what it says. It says if someone else has something against you, go and make it right. And so here is Abimelech, and God points out to him that, he has committed this error, right? That, again, in the innocence of his own heart and mind, he didn't understand, he didn't know, he was even told, she is my sister. But nevertheless, God confronts him. And so verse 4, but Abimelech had not come near her and said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? And of course, this is kind of somewhat relative because it wasn't really a righteous nation. They were Philistines. But, comparatively speaking, he didn't actually intend to sin is the point. He asks, did Abraham not say to me, she is my sister? And she even herself said, he is my brother. So in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Which is exactly how I would have responded, right? Like I didn't actually intend, I didn't know. God, you're holding me accountable for something that actually is not my fault. Well, now you know, essentially, is what God's going to say. Verse 6, and God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. For I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. And I was thinking about this. I wonder how often God actually withholds us from sinning, and we're not actually even aware that he's at work in our lives withholding us from sin, right? I imagine that this is a pretty frequent occurrence, that God protects us from things that we're not even aware of. But God says, hey, I was actually working in this and through this. Verse 7, now therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. That's actually a pretty important verse because here God describes Abraham as a prophet, and this actually is the very first time in Scripture that the word prophet occurs. This is the first time that someone actually is described as a prophet, right? And so here we have kind of the introduction of the office of prophet there in Genesis 20 and verse 7. And so he's a prophet, he's going to pray for you, and it's going to be okay. But if you don't restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. And so this is kind of like a very similar teaching we see in the book of James, right? Who knows that it's sin and does it will be held guilty for it, right? And so the idea that once we become aware that something is sinful or wrong or off, or there needs to be restoration or reconciliation, well, then the burden is upon us then to go and make it right? And so while God got his attention back in verse 3, saying, you are a dead man, God's actually not going to kill him as long as he makes things right by restoring Sarah to Abraham. I should point out that this man named Abimelech, if you know your Bibles, you might be aware that this guy keeps showing up, actually. He's going to show up later on in the next chapter. He'll reappear in chapter 26. He'll actually reappear in the book of Joshua. And you think, gosh, how old is this guy Abimelech, right? Because he keeps kind of showing up really in different generations. Well, Abimelech is not actually a proper name. It's actually a title, right? It's very similar to Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh, there were lots of pharaohs, right? Or we would say president, right? We have lots of presidents. Well, Abimelech was the same type of thing. It's a title. It's not a proper name, which is why Abimelech keeps showing up in different generations, because that wasn't his first name, right? He was like Abimelech Fred or something like that, right? And so that's not his first name is the point. Verse 8, and so Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants, and he told them all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. Now, this actually is a great example. This is the proper reaction, even by a pagan, to what we ought to do once we become aware of our sin, right? Once God reveals the sin to us, or he reveals something that needs to be restored, so the proper reaction is to get up early in the morning, as the text says, and to take care of it, and to be afraid, that is to revere God, which is what he did. And so verse 9, and Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us, and how have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom such a great sin? You've done deeds to me that ought not to be done. And so Abimelech is sort of wondering in his mind, is this entire thing an agenda that Abraham has, where he purposely kind of slipped his wife into my harem in order to bring me down when God judges me? So he's kind of thinking, kind of worst case scenario, maybe Abraham has this plan to destroy me, which is why he asks in verse 10, then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? And here's the response by Abraham. Verse 11, and Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. So it's the same thing back with Pharaoh. He's like, I've got a good-looking wife. They're going to kill me to take her, and thus I'm going to lie and say that she is my sister. Verse 12, but indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And we've talked before in class about how back in biblical times, early times, intermarriage between close relatives wasn't necessarily as big of a deal as it is today, right? Because A, there were fewer people to sort of choose from, right? But B, sin had not yet, been unfolded as much through the gene pool like it is today, right? And so today, you can't marry your half-sister. It doesn't matter how good-looking she is, right? You shouldn't even marry your cousin, right? Although I do note, in North Carolina, this is why people up north make fun of us, right? So, total side note here, this is all free. Y'all know the difference between positive law and negative law, right? Like, negative law is like no speeding, like something you can't do. Like positive law, like you have a right to vote, right? It empowers you to do something, right? Well, there's actually a positive law in North Carolina that gives you the right to marry your first cousin, right? Like, do we really need that law, right? I mean, I would suggest probably not. But hey, have at it if you're attracted to your first cousin. Although I should note, in all fairness to the state legislature, that you can't marry your double first cousin. You're like, what's that? So if my brother was to marry my wife's sister, our kids couldn't marry each other. They would be double first cousins, right? But as long as it's not your double first cousin, and you have the right in our state to marry your cousin, right? You still probably shouldn't do it, but you do have the right. As long as and there's something else too, and she has to be at least 13. The law says and so there's that. Well, Abraham's defense here is that she's my half sister, so I wasn't like totally lying, right? Well, okay, but probably still not a good idea, Abraham. Verse 13, and it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house that I said to her, this is your kindness that you should do to me in every place. Wherever we go, say of me, he is my brother. So this wasn't just kind of a one-trick thing, right? This wasn't even just twice. Like, this is what they did everywhere, right? Like, she and my sister. Which, what in the world? I mean, like, do you really want people to know that? Like, I think I ought to keep that quiet, But what's saying? Like, if that worked out, we actually have some friends. I'll probably tell you about them before, maybe. We have some friends, actually, who... I won't tell you who they are because you might actually know who they are. But they met here in school in Wake Forest. And when they were at their wedding reception, this is a true story. There is Aunt Marge, right? And they both realized that it's Aunt Marge for both of them. They actually were cousins and didn't actually know it until after they got married. You're like, how could that happen? His mother had been married and divorced like 5 times, and he wasn't totally sure about the tree and all that. But they actually did get married. The first cousins, they actually have 2 kids, which seem pretty normal. But I'm like, you know what? I mean, I'm sorry that happened to you, but I wouldn't be telling me that story, right? Because you're going to forever be an illustration in my teaching. But nevertheless, I didn't name them, right? So it can happen. But I wouldn't tell people about it, right? Well, part of his defense here is like he's telling people about it. Like, she's my sister. Like, no, family secret. Don't tell folks about that, right? Well, this is part of their shtick. Everywhere they go, he is my brother, right? Verse 14, and then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, male and female servants, and he gave them to Abraham, and he restored Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, see, my hand is before you. I'm clean. Dwell where you please. And then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who were with you and before everybody. Thus she was rebuked. And so in a sense, a second time here, it kind of works out for him, right? Like that. I mean, not only does he get his wife back, but they get a bunch of stuff, which is the same thing that happened earlier in Egypt, which is not a rationale to try this trick, by the way. But it seems to have worked out, sort of twice for them. But there is this rebuke. And so really 2 times God rebukes them through kings about lying or half lying about their relationship. And so verse 17, as God had said earlier, back in verse 5, so Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants, and they bore children. For the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so that little narrative there just kind of stuck in the text to let us know about this really kind of odd event in the life of Abraham. Well, chapter 21 and verse 1 really picks up the story where it had left off really back in the middle of Genesis chapter 18. And you'll recall that in Genesis 18, the first half of the chapter, that was the narrative when the 3 angelic beings, or the 2 angels and God, showed up. And there was this promise to Abraham of a son. And that was the time when when Sarah laughed at the promise. And actually prior to that, in chapter 17, God had appeared to Abraham and told him individually that I want you to circumcise your descendants. And by the way as well, you're going to have a son. And I want you to call him Isaac. It says back in Genesis 17, verse 21. So that was the narrative that we were following. Middle of Genesis 18, we kind of detoured into Sodom and Gomorrah for 2.5 chapters. And then there's this narrative that we just read about Abraham and Abimelech. Well, Genesis 21, verse 1 picks it up back in the middle of Genesis 18. It says, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God has spoken to him. And I mean, to me, this is kind of like a remarkably bland sort of verse, right? Because there's this promise that they've had for 25 years, right? Of a son, and their faith is ebbing and flowing. There is the attempted fulfillment with Hagar, the birth of Ishmael. And really for 25 years, like this has been the big thing. Like, when is there going to be a descendant? And we just have kind of the plain verse, verse 2 rather, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, right? There he is, right? And I'm kind of expecting sort of more. I don't know, like angels coming down and something else, right? But there he is, verse 3. And Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah had born to him, Isaac. And of course, as we talked about earlier, Isaac means laughter, which is, I think, a reminder to them that this was a promised son, and this was y'all's reaction to the promise, right? Because at the end of 17, Abraham kind of laughs in joy at the thought of the son who's going to be born in a year, which he was. And in 18, Sarah laughed, not in joy, but in disbelief, and she was confronted. And so they both laughed, and thus they named their son Laughter, or Isaac, which again I think is going to be kind of a perpetual reminder of the fact that he actually was the fulfillment of a promise, an incredible promise that God had made to them. It's actually even incredible because Abraham is 100 years old at this point in time, and coming up on chapter 25, he's going to have 6 more sons. Right, and so, man, God bless him to be that old and having children. Right, I've got a friend who, when he was 60, he had a son, and I was like, man, I hope that was worth it, man, because that's, man, you're gonna be like 78 before your son's out of the house. But man, here's this boy Isaac arrives, verse 4. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, because he'd been told to do that back in chapter 17, when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. And so I think now sort of Sarah is thinking about laughter, but she's thinking about her own joy at the birth of Isaac. And she's thinking, man, everyone else is going to laugh as well when they hear that I had a son at age 90, right? And I imagine that would have been my reaction had I heard that as a passing, visitor or whatever. Verse 7, and she also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? for I have borne him a son in his old age. And so I do think that it's reasonable sort of to think that in one sense, aging was a little bit different in this day and time, right? Because, of course, earlier to this, in the generations prior to this, we had people living, 900 years, right? And so as sin is kind of infecting the gene pool, the age of death kind of goes down, 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 right? But Abraham himself is going to live to be 147 years old, right? Which we would say is unusual. And so while people are still sort of living longer lives than most of us will, nevertheless, whatever the ratio is from, our average age of 78 to maybe their average age of 130 or 40, nevertheless, to have a child at this age was still unusual, right? And so a miracle of God has taken place. Well, verse 8, as we might expect, and I think that probably it's, while this, in one sense, it's kind of maybe easy to pile on Hagar and Ishmael here over the next few verses, I think this is probably actually a pretty reasonable response that we're going to see here. So we know from the earlier narrative, we know that there is this tension between Sarah and Hagar, right? Because back in chapter 16, as we went over, remember things got so bad that Hagar actually fled from the presence of her mistress, it says, right? So she wasn't actually cast out, but because she developed either in Sarah's mind or in reality, Hagar sort of became prideful and was kind of sneering at Sarah. Hey, I'm pregnant, by your husband, by the way, and you aren't pregnant, because that caused tension, and Sarah made her life miserable, so Hagar fled. And we saw that back in chapter 16. And you might recall that when she fled, God finds her in the wilderness, right? And says, hey, I want you to go back to Abraham, right? Like, go back to your mistress and serve them. And then there's the birth of Ishmael after that, which even causes more tension. And chronologically, that's going to be 17 years prior to this moment, right? So really for 17 years, there's been this tension, I think, whether spoken or unspoken, between Sarah and Hagar. And in Hagar's mind, she's, while probably not enjoying the tension with Sarah, which I'm sure was still there, nevertheless, she's comforted by the fact that, again, in her mind, her son Ishmael is going to be the inheritor and get all the stuff, right, that Abraham has, right, because he is Abraham's child. And so, really, while again, it must have been kind of awkward at Thanksgiving dinner for the family to sit down together, nevertheless, Hagar is probably thinking that my son's going to get the stuff, and being a 17-year-old at this point in time, Ishmael is thinking that he's going to get the stuff, right? And, well, perhaps things might have not been all happy families. They're kind of waiting for, Abraham to die because they're going to get the stuff, right? Well, all of a sudden, boom, late in life, man, Sarah has a son. And the wheels pretty much must have fallen off, right, for Hagar and Ishmael, because all of a sudden you realize that, hey, you were not going to be an inheritor. Like, you're not going to get the stuff, right? And so, verse 8, and so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And so, usually they'd be weaned about 2 or 3 years old at this point in time, and when that would happen, that was a mark of independence of a sort. So they would have a great party, and so this great party takes place. Verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, that's Ishmael, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing, or he's laughing at this, which is, there's meant to be kind of some irony here, right? Because Isaac's name is laughter, and here is Ishmael, and he's laughing. But he's not laughing in joy. He's actually kind of laughing in derision. He's scoffing because he's a bit upset because no longer is he the inheritor of Abraham's stuff, right? Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, that is Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be an heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And I love there, you got to kind of wonder about the spiritual maturity here of Sarah. That, she's so upset by this that she can't even use their names. This bondwoman who has been her personal maid for 25 years, right? Because they picked her up in Egypt when they were down there. And her son, right? Doesn't even name Ishmael. But the concern is, her and him are not going to get the stuff that is destined for my son because he's the true heir. Verse 11, and the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. Because Ishmael was Abraham's son, right? So he doesn't share the same perspective that Sarah has. Even, back in chapter 17, you might recall when God said to Abraham that you're going to actually have a son through Sarah, his response back in Genesis 17, verse 18, to God was, oh, that Ishmael might live before you, right? So, he's actually pleading for Ishmael and God's care of Ishmael before Isaac was even born, before he was even conceived, when he was just promised and named. And so Abraham doesn't have quite the same perspective. And so, in a sense, I kind of understand everyone's sort of response here, right? I understand perhaps the bitterness that Hagar and Ishmael feel. And I understand, in a sense, the perspective of Sarah, although I think it might be a bit petty, because it does seem to me that there probably was enough stuff to go around, right? Because he keeps getting more stuff every time he lies about his wife, right? And he is very rich, it says earlier in chapter 17, so there's probably enough stuff to go around. But she wants her son to get all the stuff, right? Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So that's actually a pretty surprising response to me, because you remember earlier when Hagar fled in chapter 16, God found her and said, I want you to go back to Abraham's family, right? And so God actually wouldn't kind of let her depart. But now Sarah wants to kick her out, and God's like, yeah, do what she says, right? Which, again, is not what I would expect, because it's the exact opposite response of what we saw back in chapter 16. But God's rationale for this is because Isaac is going to be the one. He is the chosen seed. And so don't worry. But hey, by the way, because I did promise to bless you, Abraham, and promise to bless your seed, because Ishmael is your seed, I'm going to bless him as well, even though he's not the chosen son, right? And again, this is the debate that's still going on today. This is why Jews and Arabs fight, right? It's because Arabs are descendants of Ishmael, and Jews are descendants of Isaac, and they're still fighting over who is the legitimate heir of the Abrahamic covenant, right? This is why they're fighting over Palestine, right? If you've ever been to Palestine before, it's like the only piece of land in the Middle East that has no oil under it, right? But they're fighting over it still, right? It's just a bunch of rocky land that no one should care about. But if you have the land, then that kind of validates your claim that you are Abraham's true seed, which is why Jews and Arabs are still fighting today. It goes all the way back to this day and time, right? And all the way back to one man's little error of trying to help God out in producing Ishmael, right? We never know who's going to be impacted by our sin down the road, right? Well, this is what God says. Verse 14, and so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread in a skin of water, and he put it on her shoulder, and he gave the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So this is, again, interesting to me, right? Because, just like Abimelech rose early in the morning, 20 verse 8, so after God speaks to Abraham, he rises early in the morning, 21 verse 14, and he sends, his son, Ishmael, and Hagar away. And, he is like Jeff Bezos, rich, right? And what does he give her? He gives her a skin of water and some bread, which I'm thinking, maybe a little more would have been nicer, right? But And so I was trying to think, like, why would he give her so little? Well, I think it's obvious kind of where she's going. She's wandering in the wilderness of Beersheba, which is due south of where they were. So I think she's going back to Egypt, which is where she was from, which makes sense, right? But he doesn't even give her enough supplies to even make it to Egypt. And I wonder if maybe there's kind of like a method to the madness here. I wonder if he gives her so little because he wants her and him to learn how to depend on God, right? Because he knows that God has promised, verse 13, to bless Ishmael, right? So he knows they're not going to die in the wilderness, right? But he also knows that they need to learn to rely upon him. And so maybe this is why he gives her so little. But it does seem to be a little cheap in my mind. But I'm sure there was a method to the madness there. Verse 15, as we might expect, and the water in the skin was used up because there was so little. And she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went out and sat down across from him at a distance, about a bow shot, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." And so she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And so, the kid's Bible picture is not correct, right? He's actually 17 years old. He's not a baby here under a little tree, right? This is like a teenage boy who was under the tree. Verse 17, and God heard the voice of the lad. So apparently she's praying. He must be praying too because God hears his voice. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." That's one of those questions that just kind of makes me chuckle. Like, there they are, like starving and dehydrated in the wilderness, and God appears and says, "What ails you?" I mean, this is like, reminds me of the narrative there in, I think it's Mark 13, where Jesus meets the blind guy, right? And he says, "What can I do for you?" Right? And it's like, really? Like, the guy's wearing like Ray Charles glasses, like, "What can I do for you?" Right? Well, he's blind, Jesus. He wants to see. Well, she needs water and food, right? But God commands, verse 18, "Arise, lift up the lad and hold him in your hand, for I will make a great nation out of him," which is what he'd promised Abraham to do, back up in verse 13. Verse 19, and then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. And so you got to wonder, like, was this well of water, was it there all along, right? Or did God, like, miraculously make the well of water at this moment, and it's really there, and then she sees it? We're not told. But whatever the deal is, there was a unseen well of water that now she sees. Verse 20, and so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt, which makes sense because that's where she was from. And so what we see kind of later on, and this is sort of like an exit stage right here for Ishmael and Hagar, although he does appear briefly coming up in a few chapters. But God does take him, and God does make 12 separate tribes out of him. And as he had said back in chapter 16, indeed he was a wild man. This is all a fulfillment of what God said he would do way back in Genesis chapter 16. Well, that kind of wraps up that narrative. Well, end of chapter 21, there's one last story here of a covenant between Abraham and Abimelech, and this is the same Abimelech that we saw in the last chapter. It says, verse 22, and it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, and those are actually both titles, kind of like president and commander maybe, they spoke to Abraham and they said, "God is with you in all that you do," which this is an amazing, I think, observation that really kind of, it perhaps in one sense ought to be convicting, right? So, like, you would think that given all that had happened back in chapter 20, right? Abraham lies to Abimelech. God essentially closes the womb of everyone in Abimelech's kingdom, which would be equivalent to like economic collapse. And there's the rebuke. And like you would think that there'd be like this really frosty relationship, right, between Abraham and Abimelech, in my mind at least, and maybe there was. But over the course of time, however long this was, maybe over a year or two at the most, that because Abraham is living in proximity to Abimelech and is probably still visiting Gerar, which was the chief city, and was trading there, that Abimelech has had enough exposure to Abraham that he actually realizes and says, "Man, God is with you in all that you do." And I can think of people that I've met and my paths have crossed over the years that I would say the same thing. That there are some people that it just seems like that whatever they do, yes, I can see God's hand upon you. Man, that God has hooked you up. That it seems like everything that you do turns to gold. That God is with you. And whether or not we can observe that and see that in a material sense or a spiritual sense, I think in a very real sense, like this should be what we're communicating, right? What people think of us when they see us, or like when our lost friends and family and coworkers, when they see us, while they might not actually share our beliefs, there should in one sense be this irresistible attraction about us that they want to be around us, even though they're not with us, because they realize that God is with us in all that we do. Like, in other words, like maybe like at your like the place you work or your neighborhood or whatever, right? Like, maybe like all your neighbors are crazy and lost and whatever else, like mine are. Well, they that's fine, right? Because they aren't a believer and you are. But were you to move out of your current neighborhood, like we should want like the reaction of our old neighbors to be, hey, like while the Jones family really was a bit weird, and I think they were actually part of some cult in Youngsville, nevertheless, they've moved out of our neighborhood, and we're now worse off because of that, right? Or your coworker should think the same way, right? And sometimes I've experienced this. I'm not in our neighborhood necessarily because we've been there a while, but there have been times and occasions like where people have sort of like just been around me, and come and been around me and hung out around me that are lost. I'm like, what are you doing hanging out with me? But I want to think it's not just my charm and good looks. I want to think that they're concluding there's something attractive about you, right? That God is with you in all that you do. Well, lost Abimelech has concluded this about Abraham, right? And because that's true, thus he wants to get Abraham on his side, right? And so verse 23, now therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham says, and I will swear, that I agree, I will treat you justly. Verse 25, then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water, which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I didn't know about this thing. You didn't tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. And so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs in the flock by themselves. And Abimelech asked Abraham, saying, what's the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs, which you have set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be a witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called that place Beersheba, because of the two of them swore an oath there, right? And Beersheba actually means well of the oath, or some folks think it means well of the 7. But whatever it is, there's some tie-in between this sign of lambs and this covenant that's made between Abraham and Abimelech. So actually, this is important. Not only because it shows that there was some type of godliness radiating from Abraham, but also Abraham has promised that he and his descendants, implicitly, and God in us and through us, will only deal with you, Abimelech, fairly, right? We won't deal falsely with you or your offspring or your posterity, it says, right? Back up in verse 23. This is important because the people actually who were reading this was being written by Moses, right, during the Exodus event, as they're on the precipice of the Promised Land, getting ready to roll into Canaan, right, and to kill all the Canaanites, who were the descendants of Abimelech, right, which is essentially what God was teaching us, and what Moses was teaching his people is that, when we roll in and we just kill them all, which is what they did, coming up in the book of Joshua, that they actually were treating them fairly. That the Canaanites were simply getting what they deserved. I mean, the wages of sin is death, right? And God treats nobody unjustly, right? I mean, we talked about this before in class, right? It's that age-old question, like, what about the innocent man on the island who has never heard the gospel, and he dies? What's going to happen to him? Well, he's going to go straight to hell, right? Why? Because there is no innocent man on the island, right? They get that the man on the island is not innocent. He's a sinner. The wages of sin is death. He's a sinner. He deserves death and hell, which is exactly what God will give him, right? So God gives nobody less than they deserve, right? So the death of the Canaanites was exactly in accord with this covenant that Abraham made with Abimelech, right? Now, God does give some people more than they deserve. It's you and I, right? That we get heaven in Christ, and we deserve that? No. Is that God actually treating us justly? No. Is God actually showing us grace? What's grace? Grace is when you get that which you don't deserve. And so God actually treats us unjustly. He gives us more than we deserve. He gives us Christ in heaven, despite the fact that we could not and did not merit it, right? So God actually treats us unjustly, but we don't call that God being unjust. We call it God being graceful. And so, yes, the lost man who's never heard the gospel will die and go to hell, which is exactly what he deserves, because the wages of sin is death, right? Nobody goes to hell because they didn't hear the gospel. Nobody goes to hell because they rejected the gospel. People go to hell because they sin, right? And so, an important passage, because Moses here is laying the ground for the questions that those who are reading this would have been asking themselves. Hey, we're going to roll into the promised land at God's command, and we're going to kill them all? Because is that fair? Well, no, that totally is fair. That's actually what they deserve, because they're sinners, right? Verse 32. And thus they made a covenant at Beersheba, and so Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of the army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and they are called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many, many days. And so, man, that brings us kind of to the end sort of the birth of Isaac. And so we're going to pick it up next week in Genesis 22, which is a passage that I know that all of you are familiar with. It's the offering up of Isaac. And so there's going to be a time warp for about 20 years between Genesis 21 and 22. And we're going to see the quasi kind of offering of Isaac in Genesis 22, which is an important passage, not only because we're familiar with it, but because it's probably one of the most gospel-centric passages in the entire Old Testament. And if you can miss the gospel in Genesis 22, it's almost like you have your eyes closed. But we'll get there next week. Time's gone. I'll pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the examples of those who have gone before us. Lord, we're thankful for your promises and the fulfillment of them, and even the birth of Isaac, and, of course, the eventual birth of Christ. We're thankful, Lord, for your grace, thankful that you indeed have given us that which we don't deserve. We all freely admit, Lord, that you didn't save us because of our works. You didn't save us, Lord, because we were somehow attractive to you and you couldn't help yourself. Lord, you saved us simply because you loved us in your grace and your mercy. I trust, Lord, because of that, that you'd move our hearts, our minds to want to serve you better, to serve you more, that we would engage in good works, not to get saved or to stay saved, Father, but because of our thankfulness to you for all that you've done in us and through us. We do pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen. Happy New Year. See you all next year.